This really is one of the most exciting methods that you can do at this time of year. From now until the end of summer, this really is going to win you a lot of matches. It's just obvious that the harder I work and the more I feed, the more fish are coming in my peg. I can see an odd swirl and I'm getting loads more bites now. If you really want to improve your pellet waggler fishing and catch match-winning weights, keep on watching. So you are joining me today at the absolutely lovely Gold Valley Lakes in Aldershot. Now I've chose to probably sit on the most famous peg on the whole complex in 57 on Gold Lake. Now the reason why this peg is just so famous is because the cafe and the tackle shop is just there. And when you do your draw for the matches, when you're getting ready to draw your peg, you come out onto the veranda, come out onto the steps, and you can actually watch the fish cruising around where you're going to be fishing on this peg. Now for me, with the weather that we're having, with it being lovely and warm, high pressure and warm winds, the very best way to tackle a peg like this today would be the pellet waggler. So what I'm going to do today for you, I'm going to take you through the setup, exactly what hooks I use, the main line I use, the hook length, and actually how to attach the pellet waggler onto your line. And I'm going to take you through the process I go through whilst I'm fishing the pellet waggler, i.e. how I'm trying to get my pellet waggler to land, where I'm casting it in relation to how I'm feeding, and just how hard you've got to work whilst fishing the pellet waggler and to keep bites coming. But if I can get that process dead right and can get my setup dead right, so everything's landing the way that I want it to, and I can keep feeding as regular as I want to, and the wind doesn't get too bad, so I can keep everything nice and straight, hopefully I can catch you a load of big carp and F1s. So there you go, that's our first fish of the day, and it feels a real decent one, to be honest. That's the good thing about fishing with pellet waggler on pegs like this. You really do seem to catch a great stamp of fish, but it is such an exciting way of fishing. When you get a bite, if you can keep everything nice and tight, they really do. There's a very, very good chance that they can pull the rod if you can keep everything really nice and tight. But you can probably say during the intro just how busy I am, and really that is one thing for me that is massive with a pellet waggler. You see the anglers that don't cast very often, that don't feed very often, they just don't get as many bites. The very best anglers here at Gold Valley, when they're fishing a pellet waggler, they never stop moving, they never stop feeding, they never stop casting, trying to make something happen. And look at the size of that. Look at that. Right, so when I get him in the net, what I'll do, I'll just talk you through the process I go through of exactly when I think the best time to feed, the best place to cast is, and to get you the most bites. So I'll just unhook that one real quickly, pop him in the keep net. So for me, pellet waggler's changed quite a bit over like the last 5 years. Back in the day, probably this is the most famous fishery in the country for fishing with big wagglers, making a lot of noise when your float goes in and getting the fish to actually come to the float. But I really do feel like it's changed. I feel like the fish over the last few years really have wised up to that float going in. And actually, I think it's more of a deterrent now that when you're casting a lot and making a big noise with your float. So to start off with, fishing with the smallest float possible you can, that the conditions allow you to fish with, is really important. But I'll touch on that again in a minute. But I'll just talk you through the process that I like to go through. First of all, what I like to do is cast my float just past where I think my bait is going to land when I fire it out. So I'll cast, that's like 2 to 3 meters past where my bait's going to land. I'll put my rod down on my rest and just try and keep everything as straight as possible. Now, if you do get a bite just after the float's landed and the line's nice and straight, there's a very good chance it can pull your rod. The next thing I like to do is just feed 2 to 3 meters short of where that float's landed, and then wind that float back into the bait. Now what this does, oh, there was a bite, there we go. Now that demonstrates that process absolutely perfect. Now what winding your float back into your bait does, not only does it straighten your line out so everything's nice and tight, which allows you to hit more bites, but the other thing that does, winding it back into the bait, is that it puts your hook bait into your loose offerings without making a noise of the float going in. So that is the most important thing for me. Casting past your bait, feeding, winding your float back into the bait. If you don't get a bite, feed again to try and get some more fish in your peg, and then repeat the process. I know there's a lot of good anglers when they fish the pellet waggler, they feed and then cast into it, but I just feel like pellet waggler's changed. These fish are really, really cute now. They're big old fish, and even the F1s that are in this lake now are really big and wise fish. So once you get into that process of your casting to a certain distance, feeding shorter, winding your float back into your bait and making as little noise as possible, you really are going to get more bites. Now, to make this process easier, using all the right kit is essential. Using the right floats that you can cast to the distance, using the right main line, because if you don't use the right setup, you're just not going to be able to do that process correctly and as neat and as accurate as possible. Because what you've got to remember is that the straighter you can keep your line between your rod tip and your float, the more bites you're going to hit. But what I'll do, once I've put this fish into the net, I'll just talk you through my setup. But that is the process that I go through when I'm fishing and feeding and casting, and that for me is the way that I've always got the most bites within the last few years here at Gold Valley on the pellet waggler. So I've just taken a couple of minutes away from my fishing to talk you through the setup that I'm using today. Now each component of the setup really does play its part. I'll start from the bottom. The pellet band I'm using is the medium Matrix latex. Now this is really important that you use the correct bands because you don't want it to be too fiddly when you're putting an 8mm on. You want to be able to just put the 8mm straight into the band and start fishing. But you also don't want it too loose that the pellet comes off when you're casting. I'm casting quite hard today because the wind's quite strong. So the last thing that you want is to make the perfect cast where you cast nice and hard and there'll be no pellet on. So the Matrix medium latex bands are perfect for that. The hook itself is one of our brand new hooks. It's the Matrix X7. Now the most important thing that I like about this hook, not only is it ultra strong and ultra sharp, the gape of the hook is really wide, and I'm using it in a size 12 today, which is really important. You can imagine when you're trying to hit these bites, when you've got 20 to 25 meters of line out, if you're using a hook that the 8mm pellet is masking the gape of the hook, there's a very good chance the fish will be able to suck the 8mm pellet in and spit it straight back out without you even knowing. If you were to use a size 12 X7, there's a lot less chance of this happening. Once they suck that 8mm pellet in, it's a lot harder for them to spit it back out because you've got such a wide gape hook on. The actual hook length itself, you want something nice and strong, nice and robust. So I'm using 020 soft steel today, which is really, really strong. I think with a slightly heavier hook length as well, it just sinks a little bit slower as well. So just using something ultra strong is really important because the fish we're catching are really big today. I mean, the first one I caught was touching 14, 15 pounds. So using a hook length that's strong enough to match the size of the hook really is important. The main line itself is probably the most important part of this setup. Now, I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about the process that we're going through. It's really important to use the lightest float possible, but still be able to cast past your bait. Now, if I was to use thick line, i.e. 022, 023, 024, it would mean I would have to use a 6 to 8 gram waggler to reach that distance. I'm using 018 Horizon X sinking mono today, which is a really, really strong line, and 018 diameter is ultra important because even though the wind's strong today, I can still use a 5 gram pellet waggler and get to the distance that I want to be able to fish at and wind back into my bait like I was doing earlier when I touched on the process. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, why is he using sinking mono? If you're fishing a pellet waggler, you don't want your line to sink. You want your line to be floating, but the time that the line is in the water, realistically, you're never really in the water for more than 20 to 25 seconds. So having a sinking mono doesn't really make any difference that it says sinking on the spool. And the great thing about having a sinking mono is that the line itself is a touch heavier, so it doesn't get blown off course so much by the wind. Today we got a crosswind. We're using that sinking mono, makes the line a little bit heavier. There's a bit more of a chance that the line will stay nice and straight. So the mono itself, the mainline mono itself is really one important part of it. The other part of it that's ultra important is the float itself. Today I'm using a 5 gram Matrix Pellet Waggler foam. The great thing is about these pellet wagglers is you can match the ball weight so it sits and is shotted perfectly. The float itself is foam, so it casts really nice for the weight of the float, and it's got flights built into the bristle of the float, which even make it cast even straighter again. That's just lit on a little link swivel onto the main line and is held in place by 3 rubber stops. And the great thing is about setting it up like this with that little link swivel is that I can adjust the depth at any point. Now I'm using 3 of the rubber stops just below the link swivel and 1 above. I like to have 3 below because I know it's not going to move when I'm casting it nice and hard. So a really, really simple setup. You've got the float onto a link swivel, onto your main line with just gripper stops either side. Really simple, ultra important that you set it up like that. And last but not least, the rod and reel. I'm using an 11 foot today. Sometimes I do like to use a 12 when I'm casting real big distances like past my 8 mils, sometimes on venues like this. But today with the crosswind, I want to just keep everything a little bit lower so it doesn't get caught up in the crosswind. So an 11 foot Horizon X Pro, really soft and forgiving, but plenty of backbone for netting those big fish. The reel itself, Horizon X Pro 3000, which is a lovely size for pellet waggler fishing. It all balances perfect. The best thing about this reel is this clutch. I like to play all my fish off the clutch. Not only does this make it nice and smooth to eliminate any hook holds, but when I'm actually playing the fish itself, I can put the rod in between my legs, let the clutch go and carry on feeding my peg. So there's no point during the process of hooking, playing, netting the fish where you can't stop and feed, which is ultra important when you're fishing a pellet waggler. So having the correct balance between the rod, the reel, the main line, the float, the hook and the hook length is ultra important. But I can guarantee you, if you set it all up like this with these components and fish with that process, like I said, try and get away with the smallest float possible, I can assure you, you're going to catch a load of fish. So one of the best things about Peg 57 at Gold is that obviously you've got a bank to cast to. So what this allows you to do is to have two areas of peg where you can cast your float and get bites. A lot of your bites will be 3 to 4 meters away from the bank in your main bulk of the bait that you feed in. But what you can also do is every now and again, what I'm doing today, when the wind drops just a touch, I can just have an odd cast where I'm literally trying to put my float as tight into the bank as possible. Oh, that was another bite. So most of my bites will be coming exactly where I got that bite then, 3 to 4 meters off the bank. But like I said, what I can do every now and again, I can just do this. The wind's just dropped and I can plop it like literally a foot away from that bank. And more times than not, if you've rested that little area of your peg right against that bank and you're fishing in the main area of your feed, so many times you plop it in there. I can't believe that didn't go under then. You can plop it in there, nick one quickly, and then move back out into the bulk of your feed. So where I'm trying to feed in relation to the bank today is probably 3 to 4 meters off, but with the way the wind is, it makes it perfect, because every now and again you get the odd feed just go quite close to the bank, and I'm going to fish right in that main bulk of bait away from the bank, but then every now and again just have a chuck right in there. So I'm just repeating my process like I went through earlier. I've just chucked it past where most of my bait's going. I'm going to feed my pellets probably 3 meters short of that float, and then I'm just going to twitch my float right back into the middle of it, and then that's probably about 3 meters off the bank now. Now twitching it back into the feed, like I said earlier, puts your hook bait into the main bulk of the feed. It lifts your hook bait up and it straightens everything out, which is why reeling back your float back into your bait, it really is the best way of fishing for me. But that just demonstrates the two areas of the peg where I feel like I'm going to get bites today. I feel like I'm going to catch a lot of fish in the bulk of my bait, 3-4 meters off, but don't be scared every now and again. Just when the wind drops and you feel like you can cast it really accurate, just to plop it in right against the bank and just nick fish off the two areas of your peg. Don't just keep repeating the process in the same little area, because the fish will soon wise up to that. And fishing a pellet waggler this time of year really is one of my favourite ways of fishing. It's such an exciting way of fishing. I want to know, what is your favourite method for this time of year on big commercials like this? If you've enjoyed the video, make sure to like it and subscribe to the Matrix YouTube channel to have more say on further videos that we're going to film. So there you go. That process really is coming into his own. I'm feeding in a decent size area, 3-4 meters off of that bank, casting back, reeling into it, mostly fishing in my bait right in the middle of it, but then having the odd chuck right up the bank. And if I'm really work hard, keep feeding, the wind isn't too bad, keep everything nice and straight once the float's gone in, you really can put some bites together. And the fish are so big that it doesn't take you long at all to put a weight together. Most of the bites here today as well is if the line's nice and straight and I cast past, wind it back into my bait, most of them are pulling the rod. because everything's just so tight at that point. I'm using a 5-gram Matrix Pellet Waggler, so you can imagine once I've reeled that back into my bait, I've got 5 grams of lead sat there and the line absolutely perfect to the float from the hook. There's a very good chance they can pull your rod, and if they start doing that, then you know you're not going to miss many bites at all. I feel like most of the bites I've missed today is when my line isn't straight, is when I've cast out and there's a bow in the line from if the wind's picked up, or you haven't quite landed your float in the correct way. That's when you start missing bites. If you can cast out, have your line nice and straight to your float as soon as it lands, and then feed, wind back into your bait and keep that line dead straight again, that's when you're going to get into a situation where you're not going to miss many bites. If they start pulling the rod, it's just an amazing way of fishing. It's incredible, it's so exciting, because you're all nice and chilled, you're feeding, you're casting, and then all of a sudden your rod goes. Just brilliant as well, especially when the fish are this big. Look at the size of that again. They all seem to be commons as well today, real dark common carp, so, and you've just really got to take your time with them. Not fishing with the thickest of main line today, because I don't want to be fishing with real thick main lines, because then I can't use a 4-5 gram waggler to get to the distance where I need it to. I'm going to have to start stepping it up to 7-8 gram wagglers, and then that's when you start making too much noise with your float. So I'm just going to take my time with it, using a really nice forgiving rod. Got my clutch set on my reel, and just take your time. But I can't stress to you just how important that process is. When you get it right, like now, that wind just dropped a touch. If I was fishing now, I'm sure I'd be able to just feed a touch past. There we go, he's coming back, yay, and there we go. I can do everything nice and tidy. I can get that float landing right, and then all of a sudden you can have a little spell where you don't think there's many fish in your peg. All of a sudden you get that process dead right, and all of a sudden you get a fish a chuck. One of the most important things when fishing the pellet waggler is that you cast in the right manner and get the float going in and landing in the right way. So the important thing for me is that I cast nice and hard like this. As the float's going through the air, start to feather it, and then just as the float is about 1 meter above the water, you put your finger on the spool and stop everything. By putting your finger on the spool and stopping everything, not only does your hook bait go past your float and reduce any tangles, but it also means that the float hits the water and everything between your rod tip and your hook bait is dead tight, which is ultra important when you're trying to catch these fish, these big old wise carp, using this method. End of the day, you've got 20 to 25 meters of line out. Missing bites can be a problem. So landing your float nice and softly so you don't scare the fish, and also landing it in a way that everything's nice and straight and nice and tight. So I cast nice and hard, feather, and then stop. So just as that float's got about 1 meter above the water, put my finger on the spool, stop it, get everything to land nice and straight, and that really does increase your chances of hooking most of the bites you get. One other really important thing when you're pellet waggler fishing is the position of your rod rest. So what I want to do, I want to cast how I explained a minute ago. I want to cast nice and hard, start to feather and then stop. But what I want to do, my next step, is actually put the rod on the rest really quickly without moving the float. So I want to just rest it down on there. Now if my rod rest was off at an angle, there's a big risk in moving the float whilst putting your rod down on your rest. So just having your rod rest virtually directly in front of you, so that once you stop the float, you can put your rod down onto your rod rest quite quick before you pick your catapult up, feed your pellets, twitch it back into your pellets and then put it back on again. So having your rod rest virtually directly in front of you, keeping everything nice and tight between your rod tip and your float, is also a really good point, and it's going to hook you a lot more fish. If you were to have it off at an angle, the float would land and then I would have to move my rod to the rest like there. There's a good chance I can move the float and reduce the chances of getting a bite. So there you go. I've had probably one of the most enjoyable days I've ever had on a pellet waggler. Caught some massive F1s, some big carp. All the fish have been immaculate. But what has stood out for me the most is just how important it is to get into that process. Cast your float past, get it to land correctly. Feed your bait as accurate as possible. Wind back into that bait and look to try and get them to pull the rod. If you can get everything landing correctly, get them to pull the rod, feed and fish really aggressively, I'm sure you're gonna have a great day's pellet waggler fishing, and we really are in the best time of year for it now. The pressure's nice and high, the water temperature's warming up, it's 15 degrees, so I can't stress, if you fish at venues like this where you've got a big expanse of water and the carp do sit out at that 8mm fed line, it really is an amazing way of catching them. It's really enjoyable, it's an exciting way of fishing. So get out on the bank, use the setup like I've showed you today, get into that process, and I'm sure you're going to catch a load of fish.